They tried to turn the Sahara Desert into a sea. Imagine standing in the middle of the Sahara Desert and watching the sea slowly approach. Not a mirage, not a natural disaster, a man-made sea. In the 19th century, a French engineer proposed cutting through North Africa and allowing Mediterranean seawater to flow into a vast depression near the edge of the Sahara. The goal was extraordinary: flood the desert, create an enormous inland sea, and perhaps change the environment around it. It sounds like something from a science fiction movie, but this wasn't fiction. The idea was seriously discussed by engineers, explorers, politicians, and scientists. Maps were studied, expeditions were organized, the landscape was surveyed, and for a brief moment, flooding part of the Sahara did not seem completely impossible. But why would anyone want to do this? And could it actually have worked? To understand the story, we have to go back to the 19th century, a time when European engineers were becoming increasingly confident that nature could be redesigned. Railways were crossing continents, canals were connecting oceans, engineers were cutting through mountains, and the Suez Canal had just transformed global trade by connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. If humans could cut a canal across Egypt, why not reshape the Sahara? That was the thinking behind one of the strangest engineering proposals of the 19th century. The idea became closely associated with a French army officer named François Élie Roudaire. Roudaire was fascinated by a series of shallow saltwater depressions in southern Tunisia. They were known as the Chotts. One of the most important was Chott el Fadjeh. To someone standing there, it looked like a harsh and almost lifeless landscape. Salt, rock, sand, an enormous expanse stretching toward the horizon. But Roudaire believed the landscape was hiding something. What if these depressions were actually below sea level? What if seawater from the Mediterranean could be brought inland? What if an enormous basin could be transformed into an inland sea? The proposed route would begin near the Gulf of Gabes. From there, a canal could carry Mediterranean water inland toward the low-lying Chotts. Once the water entered the basin, gravity would do the rest. At least, that was the theory. Roudaire believed the resulting inland sea could do more than change the map. He thought it might change the environment. More open water would mean more evaporation. More evaporation could mean more moisture in the atmosphere, and perhaps more moisture could eventually mean more rainfall. The desert might become less hostile. Agriculture could expand. Trade could develop. New settlements could appear. An enormous body of water could suddenly exist where today there is only desert. It was a breathtaking idea. But there was a problem. The Sahara was not a perfectly measured landscape, and 19th century maps could be surprisingly wrong. Before you flood a desert, you need to know exactly where the ground is. That meant surveying, and surveying the Sahara was not easy. Teams had to cross enormous distances in extreme heat. They needed to determine elevations with much greater accuracy. Every meter mattered, because if the proposed basin was higher than expected, the sea would not flow where the engineers wanted it to. And as surveys became more detailed, the dream began to encounter reality. Parts of the proposed route and basin were not as straightforwardly below sea level as supporters had hoped. The engineering challenge became much greater. And then came an even bigger question. Would flooding the Sahara actually produce the climate transformation Roudaire imagined? This is where the 19th century vision begins to collide with modern science. Creating a large body of water in a desert would certainly change the local landscape. It would create evaporation. It would alter the immediate environment. But that does not automatically mean the surrounding desert would transform into fertile farmland. Climate systems are far more complicated than simply adding water to a dry region. Wind patterns matter. Atmospheric circulation matters. Temperature matters. The size and depth of the water body matter. And rainfall depends on far more than evaporation alone. So the central promise of the Sahara Sea was never guaranteed. But there was another reason the project remained attractive: money, trade, power. An inland sea could potentially create new transportation routes. It could support ports. It could open new economic opportunities. And in the context of 19th century French colonial ambitions in North Africa, the project had a political dimension as well. This wasn't simply about making the desert green. It was about reshaping an entire region, and Roudaire was not the only person dreaming this big. Around the same period, another engineer was imagining an entirely different Sahara Sea. His name was Donald Mackenzie. Instead of bringing Mediterranean water into Tunisia, Mackenzie looked west, toward the Atlantic. He focused on the enormous Djouf basin, stretching across parts of present-day Mauritania and Mali. Mackenzie believed that this enormous depression could potentially be connected to the Atlantic Ocean. His proposal was staggering, an artificial inland sea covering tens of thousands of square miles, a new body of water deep inside the Sahara, and potentially a connection toward the Niger River. Think about the scale of that idea, an ocean entering the desert and creating an entirely new geography. It sounds impossible today, but at the time, there was a reason some people found the concept believable. Some 19th century geologists believed parts of the Sahara had once been connected to the ocean. If the landscape had been underwater in the distant past, perhaps humans could bring the water back. That assumption gave the idea a geological foundation, or at least it seemed to. But once again, reality was more complicated. The Sahara was not simply a giant empty bowl waiting to be filled. Its geology was complex, its elevations were uncertain, and the proposed engineering works would have been enormous. The costs would have been staggering, and the benefits were far from certain. The French Sahara Sea proposal gradually lost momentum. The surveys did not provide the confidence supporters needed. The expected environmental benefits remained uncertain, and governments were not willing to spend enormous sums on a project whose results could not be guaranteed. The plan stalled. The Sahara remained dry, and the sea never came. But the idea refused to disappear. Decades later, people were still looking at deserts and seeing something that could be transformed. In the early 20th century, new versions of the concept appeared. Then came the 20th century's obsession with something even more powerful: nuclear energy. During the Cold War, American scientists and engineers explored the idea of using nuclear explosions for massive construction projects. The program became known as Operation Plowshare. One of the concepts considered involved using nuclear explosions to help create or expand large water bodies. And once again, the desert became the target of human imagination. One proposed idea involved Egypt's enormous Qattara Depression. The depression lies below sea level in parts of the western desert. The basic concept was simple. Create a route from the Mediterranean, allow seawater to enter, fill the depression, and use the resulting water body for potential power generation and other purposes. It was another attempt to turn a natural depression into a giant engineering project. But the nuclear approach created enormous problems of its own: radioactive contamination, environmental damage, political consequences, and the simple fact that nuclear explosions are not exactly ideal construction tools. The concept remained theoretical, the desert stayed untouched, and eventually, the age of peaceful nuclear excavation faded away. But the dream of transforming deserts never completely disappeared, because humans have always been fascinated by empty spaces. A blank landscape looks like an opportunity. A depression looks like a reservoir waiting to happen. A desert looks like land waiting to be transformed. And that way of thinking has produced some extraordinary achievements, but it has also produced some extraordinary failures. Consider what happened in California in 1905. The Salton Sea was not created by a carefully planned megaproject. It happened by accident. Water from the Colorado River escaped through an irrigation canal and poured into a low-lying basin. For months, the river continued flowing into the depression. A huge inland lake emerged. The event demonstrated something engineers already understood. If the geography is right, water can completely transform a landscape. But it also revealed the dangers of controlling enormous natural systems. The Salton Sea became a major environmental story of its own. Its water levels changed, its salinity increased, its ecosystem faced enormous pressures, and today, the lake is part of a complicated environmental challenge. It is a reminder that creating a body of water is only the beginning. Managing it is another problem entirely. So, what would happen if someone actually flooded part of the Sahara today? Would the desert become green? Probably not in the simple way 19th century dreamers imagined. A new sea would certainly transform the local environment. It would create new habitats. It would alter evaporation. It could affect local temperatures and humidity. But the Sahara is enormous. The climate system surrounding it is even larger. Changing one depression would not magically turn North Africa into a tropical paradise, and there could be serious consequences. Salt water could alter groundwater systems. Native desert ecosystems could be destroyed. New species could be introduced. Disease patterns could change. Local weather could shift in unpredictable ways. And once the water arrived, getting rid of it would be almost impossible. That is the lesson hidden inside the Sahara Sea. The hardest part of changing nature isn't always building the project. It's understanding what happens afterward. Because nature is not a machine with one switch. It is a network. Change one part, and other parts respond. The engineers of the 19th century could not see the entire system. Their maps were incomplete. Their climate models were primitive. Their understanding of ecosystems was limited. But their ambition was enormous. They looked at one of the harshest environments on Earth and asked a question that still sounds unbelievable today. What if we changed it? They imagined canals across deserts, oceans flowing inland, new ports, new farmland, new trade routes, entire landscapes transformed by human hands. The Sahara Sea was never built. The canals were never completed. The proposed inland oceans remained on maps and in engineering reports. But the idea survived for generations. And perhaps that's why the story still matters. Because today, our technology is vastly more powerful than it was in the 19th century. We can move mountains, divert rivers, build artificial islands, change coastlines, and influence entire ecosystems. The question is no longer simply, can we do it? Increasingly, we have to ask, should we? The men who dreamed of flooding the Sahara were not necessarily fools. They were products of an age that had just witnessed humans reshape the world on an unprecedented scale. Railways, canals, dams, cities. They had seen what engineering could accomplish. So when they looked at the Sahara, they saw another problem waiting for a solution. But sometimes, the most dangerous assumption in engineering is believing that a system is simple because it looks simple. The Sahara looks like empty land. It isn't. It is a complex ecosystem, a complex climate system, a complex geological landscape, and millions of people live around it and depend on the systems connected to it. The Sahara Sea never happened, and perhaps that was fortunate. Because sometimes, the greatest engineering achievement is not building the impossible. It is knowing when not to build it. A sea still does not cover the Sahara. The desert remains. The maps remain. And somewhere in the archives, the old plans still exist. A reminder of a time when engineers looked across the world's largest hot desert and imagined an ocean. An ocean where there was only sand. And perhaps the strangest part of the story isn't that they dreamed of changing the Sahara. It's that for a while, they genuinely believed they could.